The summer of 2020 inches, Memphis, Tennessee, was defined by a suffocating heat that seemed to rise from the asphalt and hang motionless in the humid air. It was a year where the world outside was paused by a global pandemic, forcing communities inward and behind closed doors. In the silence of locked-down neighborhoods, domestic tensions festered, often unseen and unheard by the outside world. The city, known for its soulful history and the vibrant pulse of Beale Street, was under a different kind of shroud during those months. The streets were quieter, but the violence had not ceased. It had merely moved into the shadows, into the private spaces where victims were most vulnerable. On the morning of the 12th of June 2020, the atmosphere in the South Memphis neighborhood surrounding Minna Place was heavy. This was a residential area where houses sat close together, witnessing the daily rhythms of their occupants. Neighbors knew the patterns of those living next door, and when those patterns were disrupted, the silence spoke louder than noise. It was here, in the 800 block of Minna Place, that the Memphis Police Department received a call that would unravel a tragedy far darker than a standard missing person case. The concern was for Jamesha Covson, a young woman whose absence had become palpable to those who knew her. Jamesha was not just missing, she was in a delicate state carrying a child. Her pregnancy added a layer of urgent desperation to the welfare check. In the context of homicide investigations, the timeline of discovery is critical. The first 48 hours are often cited as the window of highest probability for solving a crime, but for Jamesha, time had already run out. Officers arriving at the scene were met with the quiet exterior of a home that held catastrophic secrets. The procedure for such a call is routine. Knock, announce presence, look for signs of forced entry, and gauge the situation. However, the sensory details of a crime scene often betray the reality before a door is even breached. Upon entering the residence, the reality of the situation shifted from a welfare check to a homicide investigation. The officers discovered the body of Jamesha Covson. She had been shot. The violence inflicted upon her was absolute, ending not only her life, but the life of her unborn child. The sterile language of police reports would later describe the cause of death and the position of the body, but in that moment, the scene was a tableau of stolen potential. The house on Minna Place transformed instantly into a forensic puzzle. Crime scene tape cordoned off the block, the flashing blue lights cutting through the Memphis daylight, signaling to the neighborhood that the shadow had passed over them. Detectives from the Memphis Police Department's Homicide Bureau began the meticulous work of reconstructing the final moments of Jamesha's life. In 2020, the homicide rate in Memphis was climbing, stretching the resources of the department. Yet, the murder of a pregnant woman commands a specific, intense focus. The investigators needed to understand the dynamics of the household. Domestic homicides are rarely random. They are usually the culmination of escalating behavior, a final, fatal snap in a line of tension that has been pulled too tight. They began looking at the people closest to Jamesha, the ones who had access, the ones who had motive. The focus narrowed almost immediately to Joshua Dotson. In the orbit of Jamesha's life, Dotson was the gravitational center of the conflict. The investigation revealed a volatile relationship, the kind that law enforcement officers see too often: cycles of disputes hidden behind the walls of a shared home. Dotson was not a phantom suspect. He was a known entity in the context of the victim's life. The police did not have to hunt through a list of strangers. The danger had been sleeping beside her. As the crime scene unit technicians dusted for fingerprints and collected ballistic evidence, the narrative of the crime began to take shape. It appeared to be a brutal, intimate execution. There was no sign of a break-in by a roving predator, no indicators of a robbery gone wrong. The violence was focused and personal. The layout of the scene suggested that Jamesha had been targeted by someone she knew, someone who had been inside the sanctity of the home. The psychological profile of such a killer usually points to control, rage, and a terrifying lack of empathy. Joshua Dotson was taken into custody. In the initial phases of the arrest and processing, he appeared to be just another statistic in a violent year. The booking photos from 2020 show a man who looks unassuming, a face that would not stand out in a crowd. There was no immediate indication of the theatrical madness that would later define his presence in the legal system. At the time of his arrest, he was simply the boyfriend accused of a heinous double murder. The detectives interviewing him sought a confession, a timeline, a reason why. They were operating under the assumption that this was a crime of passion or domestic rage. They had no way of knowing that the man sitting in the interrogation room viewed himself through a lens of cinematic horror. The legal process began its slow grind. The Shelby County judicial system, like courts across the world, was grappling with the logistical nightmares of the pandemic. Backlogs grew, and defendants sat in jail for extended periods awaiting trial. Dotson remained incarcerated, a name on a docket, while the world outside moved on from the lockdowns of 2020. Seasons changed, years passed, and the case of State of Tennessee v. Joshua Dotson moved inch by inch toward a courtroom. For the family of Jamesha Covson, this wait was an agonizing purgatory. They sought justice for her and the grandchild they never got to hold, enduring the delays that are systemic in high-stakes murder trials. During this 4-year interim, Dotson's behavior began to curdle. Jailhouse environments often hardened defendants, but reports would later suggest a detachment from reality that went beyond typical institutionalization. He was not merely preparing a defense, he was constructing a persona. The silence of the cell block provided him with a stage for his own internal monologue, one where he was not a defendant fighting for his life, but a protagonist in a dark narrative of his own creation. The shadow over Memphis was not just the crime he committed, but the darkness he nurtured within himself while awaiting his day in court. By the time the trial date was set for October 2024, the case had largely faded from the public consciousness, overshadowed by newer crimes and the relentless news cycle. It was destined to be another tragic, but procedural, murder trial. A jury would be selected, evidence presented, and a verdict rendered. The prosecutors prepared a case based on forensic evidence, the fact of Jamesha's pregnancy, and the brutality of the shooting. They intended to paint Dotson as a cold-blooded domestic abuser. They did not anticipate that Dotson would perform the prosecutor's job for them and then go further, transcending the bounds of a legal defense into the realm of the grotesque. The courtroom in Division 7, presided over by Judge Lee Coffey, is a place of decorum and strict rules. It is designed to be a sterile environment where facts are weighed against the law. As the trial commenced, the atmosphere in the room shifted from procedural boredom to bewildered tension. The defendant, Joshua Dotson, did not behave like a man facing a century in prison. He did not confer anxiously with his attorneys. He did not take notes. He slept. Slumped at the defense table, he treated the proceedings with a lethargy that bordered on catatonic. To the jury, this visual was striking a man accused of killing his pregnant girlfriend, dozing while the autopsy photos were discussed. But the sleeping was merely the prelude. The true shadow revealed itself when Dotson insisted on taking the stand. Against the frantic advice of his legal counsel, who recognized the suicide mission of such a move, Dotson walked to the witness box. This is the moment where a standard true crime narrative fractures into something unparalleled. Usually, a defendant testifies to claim innocence, to offer an alibi, or to plead for mercy. Dotson did none of these things. He sat before the jury, the judge, and the grieving family, and he shed the mask of the unassuming defendant. The man who had slept through the evidence woke up to claim it. In a monotone that chilled the courtroom, he didn't just admit to killing Jamesha Covson. He claimed a legacy of violence that the police had not even attributed to him. He spoke of other bodies, other crimes, weaving a tapestry of bloodshed that he wore like a badge of honor. He looked at the jury and stripped away any pretense of humanity, invoking the name of a fictional, unstoppable force. "I am Michael Myers," he declared. The reference to the Halloween antagonist was not an accidental slip of the tongue, it was a statement of identity. He was aligning himself with pure evil, with a creature that cannot be reasoned with, only feared. This declaration cast a retroactive shadow over the events of June 2020. It reframed the murder on Minna Place not as a domestic tragedy, but as the act of a man who saw himself as a predator of mythic proportions. The Memphis heat, the pandemic silence, the missing pregnant woman, all of it was recontextualized by his testimony. The prosecutor, usually tasked with dismantling a defendant's lies, found themselves in the surreal position of cross-examining a man who was eagerly constructing his own coffin. Dotson's testimony was a freefall into the abyss. He detailed the killing with a clinical detachment that matched the fictional character he emulated. He claimed to be a serial killer, a term that carries specific legal and psychological weight, tossing it out casually to a room full of stunned observers. Whether these claims of other murders were true or the fabrications of a disturbed mind seeking infamy, they achieved their goal. They terrified. As the trial reached its conclusion, the coincidence of the calendar seemed written by a screenwriter. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the 31st of October 2024, Halloween. The day of the year dedicated to the macabre, the day associated with the very fictional monster Dotson claimed to be. The irony was heavy, almost literary in its precision. The city of Memphis, which had seen the crime begin in the sweltering heat of a pandemic summer, now watched it end on the Day of the Dead. Judge Lee Coffey, a veteran of the bench known for his no-nonsense approach, was left to pass judgment on a man who had made a mockery of the sanctity of life and the court. The 102-year sentence that would be handed down was a mathematical guarantee that Joshua Dotson would never again walk the streets of Memphis. But before the gavel could fall, before the years could be tallied, the court had to grapple with the entity sitting at the defense table. The shadow that had fallen over Minna Place in 2020 had finally taken a definitive shape in the harsh lighting of the courtroom, revealing a darkness that went beyond the charge of second-degree murder. This was not just a case of who did it. It was a harrowing exploration of what lived inside the mind of the man who slept while his life was dismantled. To understand how a courtroom in 2024 became the stage for a horror film reenactment, one must first dismantle the timeline and return to the stifling atmosphere of Memphis in early 2020. Before Joshua Dotson became a viral headline for sleeping through his own defense, and before he invoked the name of a fictional slasher villain to describe his soul, he was simply a man entangled in a volatile relationship with Jamesha Covson. The path to the 102-year sentence did not begin with the bang of a gavel but with the quiet, creeping erosion of trust within a small apartment. The relationship between Dotson and Covson emerged against the backdrop of a global pandemic, a time when the world was contracting. For many couples, the lockdowns and social isolation of 2020 brought them closer. But for those in abusive dynamics, the quarantine acted as a pressure cooker. There was no escape valve. Jamesha Covson, a young woman with a future ahead of her, found her world shrinking rapidly once Joshua Dotson entered it. In the beginning, as is often the case in narratives of coercive control, the intensity was mistaken for affection. Dotson was present, attentive, and seemingly invested. However, looking back through the lens of the tragedy that followed, the signs of ownership were already being laid like bricks in a wall. The dynamic shifted subtly from romance to surveillance. Control is rarely seized in a single moment. It is taken in increments. It starts with a question about a phone call, then evolves into a demand to see text messages, and eventually hardens into a prohibition against leaving the house. For Dotson, the need for control appeared to stem from a deep-seated pathology, a void where empathy should have resided. He viewed Jamesha not as an autonomous partner, but as an extension of his own reality, a reality that was becoming increasingly fractured and dangerous. As the spring of 2020 turned into a humid Tennessee summer, the couple discovered Jamesha was pregnant. In a healthy relationship, the news of a child brings a sense of shared responsibility and hope. For Dotson, the pregnancy seemed to trigger an escalation in his territorial instincts. The stakes were higher now. Jamesha was carrying his biological legacy, which, in his distorted worldview, stripped her of any remaining independence. She was no longer just his girlfriend. She was a vessel containing his property. This dehumanization is a critical psychological precursor to violence. Once a perpetrator stops seeing their partner as a human being and starts viewing them as an asset or a liability, the moral barriers to murder begin to dissolve. The catalyst that turned this control into lethal intent was paranoia. Dotson moved through the streets of Memphis with a mindset heavily influenced by the code of the streets, yet twisted by his own delusions. He harbored secrets. Whether these were tangible crimes he had already committed as he would later boast about in court, or simply the phantoms of a guilty conscience, Dotson was a man constantly looking over his shoulder. This hypervigilance bled into his domestic life. He began to view Jamecia not as his confidant, but as a potential leak. The concept of snitching is a powerful and dangerous accusation in certain subcultures, often carrying an implied death sentence. Usually, this term is reserved for informants within criminal enterprises. Dotson, however, weaponized the term against the mother of his unborn child. His paranoia fabricated a narrative where Jamecia was conspiring against him. Every missed call became suspicious. Every silence was interpreted as a tactical pause. He became obsessed with the idea that she was speaking to law enforcement, or, perhaps worse, in his mind, to his enemies. The logic was circular and impenetrable. He was afraid of being caught for his actions, so he terrified the person closest to him, and her fear was then reinterpreted by him as guilt. This psychological torment is known as Darvo deny, attack and reverse victim and offender. Dotson convinced himself that he was the target. In his internal monologue, which would later spill out on the witness stand in a shocking display of narcissism, he wasn't the abuser terrorizing a pregnant woman. He was the vulnerable party being set up. He projected his own predatory nature onto Jamecia. He believed she had the power to destroy him with a word, and this power imbalance was unacceptable to a man who required absolute dominance. Friends and family often sense the withdrawal of a victim long before the violence becomes public. Jamecia's world became smaller. The isolation tactics Dotson employed meant that her support system was systematically cut off. He needed her to be dependent on him, not just for resources, but for her definition of reality. If she claimed she wasn't talking to the police, he would gaslight her until she questioned her own memory or sanity. He created a siege mentality within their home. The outside world was the enemy, and anyone trying to enter their circle was a threat. The tension in the household grew palpable as June approached. The heat in Memphis rose, mirroring the volatility of Dotson's temper. The accusations of snitching became more frequent and more bizarre. It is difficult for a rational mind to comprehend the leaps of logic required to believe a pregnant partner is plotting a sophisticated sting operation, but domestic paranoia does not require evidence. It feeds on insecurity. Dotson's behavior suggests he was projecting his own capacity for betrayal onto her. Because he was capable of turning on anyone, he assumed she was doing the same to him. This period was marked by a distinct lack of emotion from Dotson regarding the pregnancy. While Jamecia was preparing for motherhood, Dotson was preparing for war. He saw the unborn child not as a new life, but as another tether binding him to a woman he no longer trusted. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that Jamecia likely stayed in part because of the child. Victims often believe that the arrival of a baby will soften the abuser, or they fear leaving because the abuser has threatened to take the child. Dotson likely used the pregnancy as leverage, a tool to keep her within his grasp, even as he accused her of treachery. The Michael Myers persona that Dotson would later embrace in court, a figure defined by a soulless, unstoppable drive to kill, did not appear out of thin air. It was being cultivated during these weeks of torment. The fictional character of Michael Myers is terrifying because he is devoid of motive and human connection. He is simply the shape. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Dotson began to embody this dissociation. He detached himself emotionally from Jamecia. She ceased to be a person he loved and became an obstacle he needed to remove. The man who would later sleep through his trial was already asleep to his own humanity. Arguments over snitching likely intensified. In the claustrophobic environment of the apartment, there was no room for Jamecia to prove her innocence because the crime she was accused of betrayal existed only in Dotson's mind. He was the judge, jury, and executioner of a trial taking place entirely within his own headspace. He looked for confirmation of his paranoia in everything she did. If she went to the store, who did she see? If she was on the phone, who was listening? The paranoia was a hungry beast that demanded to be fed, and eventually, verbal accusations were no longer enough to satiate it. The psychological infrastructure for the murder was built on this foundation: a belief that he was entitled to control her, a delusion that she was an enemy combatant, and a complete lack of regard for the life she carried. The snitch label served a dual purpose. First, it justified his anger. Second, it provided a preemptive excuse for the violence he was planning. In criminal circles, silencing a snitch is seen by some as a necessary act of survival. By categorizing Jamesha as a snitch, Dotson was giving himself permission to eliminate a threat. He was rewriting the narrative of domestic violence into one of street justice. As the fatal day in June drew closer, the warning signs were likely flashing neon red, though obscured by the privacy of their residence. The volatility of the relationship had reached a terminal velocity. Dotson's demeanor shifted from hot rage to cold calculation. The paranoia had solidified into a verdict. He had convinced himself that she was working against him, that the walls were closing in, and that she was holding the key to his destruction. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. His fear of being caught for his past actions drove him to commit the one act that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The build-up to the murder of Jamesha Kobson was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense, where a sudden snap of emotion leads to tragedy. It was a slow-motion car crash of ego and delusion. It was the result of a man who valued his own freedom above the lives of his girlfriend and unborn child, yet possessed a definition of freedom that was paradoxically imprisoning. He was a prisoner of his own suspicions long before the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. By the time the violence erupted, the man Jamesha had known was gone, replaced by the entity Dotson would later proudly proclaim himself to be. The transition was complete. He had stripped her of her humanity in his mind, labeled her a traitor, and prepared himself to act with the remorseless efficiency of the horror villain he idolized. The paranoia about snitching was merely the final lock clicking into place, sealing Jamesha's fate and setting the stage for a courtroom spectacle 4 years later that would leave a judge, a jury, and a city questioning the very nature of evil. The silence in the apartment was about to be broken, but the silence Dotson imposed on Jamesha was intended to be eternal. In his mind, reducing the woman he once claimed to love into an obstacle, a source of betrayal, and finally, a target. This psychological erasure is often the final precursor to domestic homicide. The perpetrator ceases to see a partner and begins to see a problem that requires a permanent, violent solution. On the 12th of June 2020, inside the residence on Minna Place in Memphis, Tennessee, that solution manifested in the form of a loaded firearm. The atmosphere inside the home that Friday was suffocating, heavy with the humid Tennessee heat and the denser weight of unvoiced hostility. Joshua Dotson moved through the space with a detachment that would later puzzle investigators and terrify a jury. He was not behaving like a man in the throes of a passionate rage, but rather someone operating on a cold internal logic. The paranoia that had been festering for weeks had crystallized into a singular intent. Jamesha Kobson, pregnant with their child, was no longer safe within the walls of her own home. The sanctuary of the domestic space had been corrupted by Dotson's spiraling mental state. Forensic reconstructions of the event suggest that the violence, when it arrived, was not a chaotic brawl but a decisive execution. Dotson armed himself. The presence of the weapon introduced a finality to the afternoon. In many domestic homicide cases involving firearms, the introduction of the gun changes the dynamic instantly, shifting the power balance entirely to the holder. Dotson, holding the weapon, assumed the role he would later explicitly claim in open court. That of a predator, a character devoid of empathy, akin to the fictional slasher Michael Myers. Whether he truly believed himself to be a horror icon at that specific moment, or adopted the persona later to rationalize his brutality, remains a question for psychiatrists. But his actions on that June day mirrored the callousness of the character he idolized. Jamesha was vulnerable. The exact choreography of the shooting revealed a lack of hesitation on Dotson's part. When he raised the gun, he did not see the mother of his unborn child. He saw the subject of his delusions. The shots rang out, shattering the silence of the neighborhood. The report of a firearm in a residential area is a jarring, alien sound, often mistaken for fireworks or a car backfiring by neighbors, until the rhythm of the shots reveals the darker truth. In the case of Jamesha Kovson, the gunfire was the sound of a life being extinguished. Dotson fired multiple times. This repetition is significant in criminological analysis. A single shot might argue for an accident or a momentary lapse of control that is immediately regretted. Multiple shots indicate a sustained desire to kill, a commitment to the act that persists through the recoil, the noise, and the visual reality of the violence. Each pull of the trigger was a reaffirmation of his intent. He struck Jamesha in the chest, a fatal proximity that allowed for no survival. The violence was intimate. He was not firing from a distance or blindly around a corner. He was there, in the room, witnessing the impact of the bullets. The tragedy was compounded by the physiological reality of Jamesha's pregnancy. At the moment the bullets struck her, they also sealed the fate of the unborn child she carried. The law and the medical examiner would later document this as a double loss. The biological connection between mother and fetus meant that as Jamesha's systems failed, as her heart ceased to pump and her lungs ceased to draw breath, the life growing inside her was simultaneously suffocated. The violence Dotson inflicted was total. It wiped out a future generation. The specific cruelty of murdering a pregnant partner speaks to a level of malice that transcends typical criminal classifications. Landing firmly in the realm of the monstrous, a term Dotson would essentially embrace during his trial. After the shooting stopped, the house on Minna Place fell silent again. This silence is often described by first responders as heavier than the quiet that existed before. It is the silence of absence. Dotson, standing amidst the aftermath of his actions, did not immediately rush to aid the victim. There was no frantic call to 911, no desperate attempt to stem the bleeding or perform CPR. The behavior consistent with the Michael Myers persona he would later invoke suggests a total dissociation from the horror of the scene. He observed the result of his work with a flat affect. The woman who had shared his life was dead, and the child they had created was gone. To the average observer, this is a catastrophe. To Dotson, in that warped moment, it appeared to be a resolution. The timeline following the shots reflects a man unburdened by immediate remorse. He did not collapse in grief. Instead, the sequence of events implies a chilling preservation of self. He remained in the house with the body for a period, occupying the same space as the murder scene. This behavior lingering with the victim is a terrifying hallmark of certain types of disorganized killers, or those suffering from profound delusions. It implies that the reality of the corpse was not disturbing to him. The disconnect between his actions and societal norms was absolute. He had crossed a threshold on June 12 that he would never recross. When he eventually made the decision to leave the scene, it was not a panicked flight but a departure. He left Jamesha Kovson lying where she had fallen. He abandoned the home, leaving the evidence of his crime to be discovered by others. The act of leaving the body is a final indignity, reducing the victim to mere evidence, an object to be found. By walking out the door, Dotson attempted to physically distance himself from the crime, even as he carried the knowledge of it with him. He moved out into the Memphis streets, blending back into the world of the living, while behind him, the crime scene began to undergo the slow, grim processes of biology and time. The discovery of the body would shatter the lives of Jamesha's family. For the initial period after the murder, however, the crime existed in a vacuum. It was a secret held only by the killer and the silent walls of the residence. This interim period is crucial in the timeline of the murder. It represents the gap between the act and the accountability. During these hours, Dotson was a free man, technically, though he was bound by the invisible chains of his own deed. The delusion that justified the killing likely persisted, shielding him from the immediate psychological crash that often follows a crime of passion. He did not feel the weight of the 102 years that awaited him. He felt, presumably, the numbness of the character he emulated. When police and emergency services eventually arrived at Minna Place, the scene they encountered was one of stark devastation. The clinical nature of the police reports contrasts sharply with the emotional devastation evident in the room. Officers found Jamesha Kovson deceased from gunshot wounds. The visual evidence told the story of a one-sided attack. There were no signs that Jamesha had posed a lethal threat to Dotson. She was the victim of an ambush within her own domestic sphere. The realization that she was pregnant added a layer of grim urgency to the investigation. Homicide detectives are accustomed to death, but the murder of an expectant mother activates a specific, intense drive for justice. The crime scene technicians began the meticulous work of documenting the atrocity, photographing the positioning of the body, collecting shell casings, and swabbing for DNA. They were mapping the geography of a nightmare. The physical evidence pointed largely in one direction. In domestic homicides, the partner is always the primary person of interest, but the specificity of the violence here left little doubt. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer had a key or was welcomed into the home. The intimacy of the killing suggested a personal relationship. The dots connected rapidly back to Joshua Dotson. However, the man himself was gone, having slipped away into the city, carrying his dark narrative with him. The murder of Jamesha Kovson on the 12th of June 2020 was not merely a result of a heated argument gone wrong. It was the culmination of a deteriorating mental state that required a victim to validate its delusions. Dotson's later testimony, where he would sit in the witness stand and attribute his actions to the fictional serial killer Michael Myers, provides the retrospective context needed to understand the crime. He did not view the murder as a mistake. He viewed it as a character arc. When he pulled the trigger, he was enacting a fantasy of power and control, imposing his will on the only person vulnerable enough to be within his reach. The brutality of the act stands in stark contrast to the lethargy Dotson would later display in court. The man who slept at the defense table while facing a century in prison was the same man who had summoned the energy to execute his girlfriend. This duality, extreme violence followed by extreme passivity, is the defining characteristic of the case. On that Friday in June, the violence was paramount. He extinguished a light in the world with a terrifying casualness. The bullets that ended Jamesha's life were the physical manifestation of a psychological break that had been widening for months. As the sun set over Memphis on the day of the murder, the reality of the loss began to ripple outward. Friends and family who could not reach Jamesha began to worry. The silence from her end became conspicuous. The vibrant young woman, looking forward to the birth of her child, had been erased from the timeline of the future. The house on Minna Place, once a home, was now a crime scene, taped off and illuminated by the flashing blue lights of police cruisers. Inside, the story of what happened was written in blood and ballistics, a story of a protector turned predator, and a trust violated in the most absolute way possible. Joshua Dotson had completed his transformation. He had become the monster he believed himself to be, and in doing so, he had taken everything from Jamesha Kovson. The silence that had unnerved Jamesha's family was broken not by a phone call from her, but by a grim discovery on the 12th of June 2020. In a residential neighborhood in Memphis, the stillness of a parked vehicle drew the attention of passers-by. The summer heat was already rising, baking the asphalt and intensifying the dread of those who approached the car. Inside, the search for the expectant mother came to a devastating halt. Jamesha Kovson was found unresponsive, her life ended by gunfire. The responding officers immediately secured the perimeter, stringing yellow tape that fluttered in the humid breeze, creating a boundary between the gathered onlookers and the tragedy within. For the homicide detectives arriving on the scene, the initial walkthrough presented a bleak tableau. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a random act of vehicular violence. The intimacy of the violence suggested a personal connection. There were no signs of a struggle that indicated a stranger abduction. As forensics teams began the meticulous process of photographing the vehicle, collecting shell casings, and swabbing for biological trace evidence, a parallel investigation began in the digital realm, one that would yield the most damning piece of evidence before the physical ballistics were even fully analyzed. While investigators were still in the preliminary stages of identifying the victim and notifying the next of kin, A jarring anomaly rippled through the local social media network. A Facebook post appeared, circulating rapidly among Jamesha's friends and acquaintances. It was a memorial, a digital eulogy, mourning the death of Jamesha Kovson. To a stranger scrolling through their feed, it looked like a standard outpouring of grief, a tragic acknowledgement of a life cut short in a city too often touched by violence. However, to the detectives and the frantic family members, the post was a catastrophic error in the killer's logic. The post had been created and published before the police had officially identified the body or released any information to the public. At the time the memorial went live, Jamesha was essentially a Jane Doe to the wider world, her fate known only to the officers at the scene and the person who ended her life. The existence of the post was a temporal impossibility for an innocent bystander. It contained knowledge that only the perpetrator could possess. The author of the post was Joshua Dotson. Dotson had attempted to engineer a narrative of sorrow, positioning himself as a grieving boyfriend before the crime had even been fully discovered. He used the platform to announce her death, framing it as a tragedy he was reacting to rather than one he had caused. This clumsy attempt at misdirection became the pivot point of the entire investigation. He had tried to hide in plain sight, using a fake memorial, fake not in the reality of the death but in the sincerity of the grief to deflect suspicion. He wanted to be seen as a victim of loss, but instead, he revealed himself as the architect of the crime. Detectives zeroed in on this digital footprint. They analyzed the timestamps, cross-referencing the moment the post was uploaded with the timeline of the 911 call and the arrival of the first responders. The discrepancy was glaring. Dotson was mourning a murder that, according to his official narrative, he shouldn't have known about yet. The investigation shifted immediately from a whodunit to a focused pursuit of Dotson. The police theorized that his psychological need to control the narrative, a trait that would later explode into bizarre theatricality during his trial, had compelled him to break the news himself. He couldn't wait for the police to tell the story. He had to write the headline. Following this digital breakthrough, the physical investigation accelerated. Investigators tracked Dotson's movements, correlating his location data with the crime scene. The facade of the grieving father-to-be crumbled under the weight of the timeline he had inadvertently established. When detectives brought him in for questioning, the arrogance that would later lead him to sleep at the defense table was already present. He maintained his innocence, but his behavior was detached, his affect flat. He spoke of Jamesha, not with the emotional devastation of a partner, but with the cold distance of an observer. The police exploited the information gap. They questioned him about how he learned of her death, watching as he navigated the trap he had set for himself on Facebook. Every explanation he offered for the premature memorial post contradicted the known facts. He claimed to have heard it from others, but phone records showed no such incoming calls prior to his post. He claimed intuition, a feeling, but the specificity of his online declaration betrayed him. The digital memorial, intended to be his shield, became his confession. As the interrogation proceeded, the forensic evidence began to align with the digital trail. Ballistics recovered from the scene were consistent with a weapon linked to Dotson. The investigation revealed a pattern of escalating tension and violence in the relationship, confirming the motive that the crime scene suggested. The image of Dotson as a serial killer in waiting, a persona he would later eagerly embrace in open court, began to form in the minds of the investigators. They weren't dealing with a crime of sudden passion, but a calculated elimination followed by a sociopathic attempt at public relations. The arrest was the inevitable conclusion of a trap Dotson had sprung on himself. By trying to control the public perception of Jamesha's death, he had handed the police the keys to the case. The community, initially confused by the early memorial, now looked at the post with horror, realizing they had been witnessing a killer's performance in real time. The breakthrough was total. It wasn't just DNA or a witness that caught Joshua Dotson. It was his own hubris, his compulsion to insert himself into the story, that bridged the gap between a silent car on a Memphis street and the 102-year sentence that awaited him. The investigation closed with the grim satisfaction that the man who tried to write the ending of Jamesha's life had unwittingly written the first chapter of his own incarceration. The interrogation room at 201 Poplar Avenue in Memphis offered no comfort to the man who had just tried to script the narrative of his girlfriend's death on social media. Joshua Dotson sat across from homicide detectives, the fluorescent lights humming over a tableau of calculated indifference. Investigators were accustomed to suspects who screamed, cried, or frantically spun webs of denial. Dotson presented a different challenge entirely. He appeared detached, almost bored, displaying a level of lethargy that would later baffle a courtroom. The detectives sought to exploit the timeline discrepancies created by his premature memorial post, pressing him on how he knew Jamesha Covson was dead before the police had even processed the scene. Dotson's responses in the interview room were a frustrating mix of evasion and arrogance. He did not behave like a grieving boyfriend who had just lost his partner and unborn child. Instead, he operated with a chilling detachment, treating the questions as minor inconveniences rather than serious accusations of capital murder. He offered no credible alibi for the window of time in which Jamesha was killed. When confronted with the digital trail he had left behind the timestamp of his Facebook post relative to the discovery of the body, he provided no logical explanation. To the seasoned investigators, his silence and lack of emotional affect were as damning as a confession. They watched his body language, looking for signs of stress or guilt, but found only a void. It was the behavior of a man who believed he was untouchable, or perhaps someone who simply did not care about the consequences of his actions. While Dotson stonewalled detectives, the forensic teams were dismantling the crime scene at Jamesha Covson's apartment. The physical evidence began to tell the story that Dotson refused to vocalize. There were no signs of forced entry at the residence, a detail that immediately narrowed the suspect pool to those with access or those Jamesha trusted. This fact aligned perfectly with the theory that the killer was someone intimate with the victim. Inside, the violence was specific and personal. Jamesha had been shot. Her life ended in the sanctuary of her own home. The medical examiner's report added a layer of tragedy that elevated the stakes of the investigation. Jamesha was pregnant, a fact Dotson was well aware of. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as gunshot wounds, but it was the recovery of ballistics evidence that would act as the tether binding Dotson to the act. Crime scene technicians scoured the apartment for fingerprints, DNA, and shell casings. They focused on the areas where the shooter would have stood, mapping out the trajectory of the bullets. The lack of struggle suggested an ambush or a sudden escalation by someone the victim did not fear until the final moment. Every swab and fiber collection was catalogued, building a mosaic of the final moments of Jamesha's life. The forensic analysis extended to Dotson's own belongings. Investigators seized his clothing and personal effects, searching for microscopic transfer evidence, gunshot residue, blood spatter, or fibers that matched the crime scene. In modern homicide investigations, the digital forensics often weigh as heavily as the biological. Dotson's phone was a critical piece of the puzzle. Analysts extracted location data, call logs, and text messages, reconstructing his movements in the hours leading up to and following the murder. The device painted a picture of his communications and his whereabouts, contradicting any vague denials he offered in the interview room. As the investigation transitioned from the chaotic initial days to the slow grind of legal preparation, Dotson's behavior in custody became a focal point for the prosecution. Jails are not soundproof. They are environments where behavior is constantly observed and recorded. In the Shelby County Jail, Dotson did not exhibit the restlessness of a man falsely accused fighting to clear his name. He settled into a routine marked by the same strange lethargy observed during his arrest. He was frequently seen sleeping or appearing entirely disengaged from his surroundings. This was not the sleep of the innocent, but a profound disinterest in the gravity of his situation. Reports from correctional officers and interactions with appointed legal counsel hinted at a difficult defendant. He was dismissive of legal advice, showing an unwillingness to collaborate on his own defense strategy. This behavior in custody was a precursor to the spectacle that would later unfold in court. Defense attorneys appointed to represent him found themselves hitting a wall. A typical client engages with the evidence, asks questions about the witness list, or discusses plea variations. Dotson remained aloof. He treated the legal proceedings as if they were happening to someone else, or as if the outcome was irrelevant to his reality. This detachment raised questions about his competency, leading to delays as psychological evaluations were considered to ensure he was fit to stand trial. The system had to be certain that his sleeping and silence were choices, not symptoms of an inability to understand the charges. The evaluations returned with the conclusion that Dotson was competent, stripping away any potential defense based on insanity or incapacity. He knew what was happening. He simply chose to engage with it on his own bizarre terms. The forensic ballistics report eventually returned, solidifying the case. The analysis of the projectiles recovered from the scene and the weapon linked to the investigation provided the mechanical proof needed to charge him. The science did not care about his indifference. It matched the striations on the bullet to the barrel of the gun, creating a link that no amount of courtroom sleeping could sever. Combined with the timeline established by the digital forensics placing him in the vicinity and highlighting his premature knowledge of the death, the state's case moved from circumstantial to concrete. The prosecutor's office began to assemble the narrative for the jury, one that depicted a cold-blooded execution followed by a failed attempt at manipulation. Throughout the pretrial hearings, Dotson's demeanor remained consistent. He cycled through attorneys, his dissatisfaction with his representation stemming not from their lack of skill, but from their refusal to indulge his delusions of grandeur or his warped view of the law. He seemed to view the legal teams as obstacles rather than advocates. This friction resulted in a revolving door of counsel, further dragging out the timeline of the case. In the holding cells and meeting rooms, he would often ignore the advice to remain silent, hinting at a desire to tell his own version of events. His lawyers warned him of the dangers of self-incrimination, especially given the weight of the forensic evidence against him, but Dotson's arrogance made him deaf to caution. He believed he could outsmart the room, or perhaps he just wanted the spotlight, regardless of the cost. The prosecution also examined his history, looking for patterns of violence that could be introduced if the door was opened during sentencing. They found a man whose relationships were defined by control and volatility. The murder of Jamisha Kovson was not an isolated incident of rage, but the culmination of a deteriorating psychological state. The evidence gathered from his phone revealed a man obsessed with his own image, even as he destroyed the lives around him. Text messages sent prior to the murder showed friction and animosity, dismantling any potential defense of a happy relationship gone wrong by accident. The motive, while rooted in domestic conflict, appeared to be exacerbated by Dotson's cold calculation that eliminating the problem was a viable solution. By the time the trial date approached, the evidence boxes were full. Photos of the blood-stained apartment, the autopsy diagrams of the mother and unborn child, the cell phone tower triangulations, and the interview transcripts all waited to be presented. Yet, the most unpredictable piece of evidence remained Joshua Dotson himself. His behavior in custody, sleeping during meetings, ignoring discovery documents, and staring blankly at the walls unnerved those preparing the case. It was the calm before a storm of absurdity. Prosecutors prepared for a defense that might argue lack of intent or mistaken identity, but they could not predict that the defendant's primary strategy would be to nap through the proceedings until he decided to wake up and destroy his own chances. The jail logs from the weeks leading up to the trial showed a man who was eating, sleeping, and existing in a state of suspended animation. There were no frantic calls to relatives begging for alibis. There were no jailhouse confessions to cellmates, largely because he viewed himself as superior to those around him. He kept his own counsel, saving his thoughts for the moment he could deliver them to an audience he felt was worthy of his attention. The silence he maintained in the interview room had mutated into a weaponized indifference. He was resting, preserving his energy not for a legal battle, but for a performance. The investigators had done their job. They had the gun, the digital footprint, and the body. They had a defendant who offered no resistance to the facts, only a terrifying apathy toward the moral weight of his crime. As the transfer van prepared to move him from the jail to the courthouse for the commencement of the trial, Dotson remained a cipher, a blank slate upon which he intended to write a horror story of his own design. The courtroom in Memphis became a theater of the absurd as the trial of Joshua Dotson commenced. Inside the Shelby County Criminal Justice Center, the air was heavy with the tragic weight of the charges, the murder of Jamesha Covson and her unborn child. Yet, at the defense table, the man at the center of this grim proceeding appeared to be entirely disengaged from the reality of his situation. The silence he had maintained during the investigation transformed into a bizarre spectacle of lethargy. As prosecutors laid out the timeline of the brutal killing, detailing the forensic evidence and the tragic loss of life, Dotson did not take notes. He did not whisper frantically to his attorneys or study the jury to gauge their reactions. Instead, he slept. It was not merely a doze or a momentary lapse in attention. Dotson slumped in his chair, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence that infuriated observers. The gallery, filled with the grieving family of Jamesha Covson, watched in disbelief as the man accused of ending her life treated his capital murder trial as an inconvenience to his rest. This behavior presented a unique challenge for the court. A sleeping defendant risks the integrity of the judicial process, potentially opening grounds for appeal based on competence or the ability to assist in one's own defense. His attorneys were frequently seen nudging him, whispering urgently, trying to rouse him from his slumber. At times he would stir, look around with a glazed expression of annoyance, and then retreat back into his self-imposed dormancy. It was a display of contempt so profound that it seemed calculated, a silent assertion that the proceedings were beneath him. The prosecution continued their case, building a mountain of evidence that pointed squarely at Dotson. They presented the gruesome details of the crime scene, the timeline of events leading up to the murder, and the devastating impact on the Covson family. Through it all, the defense table remained a scene of awkward tension. Dotson's legal team worked diligently to provide a defense, but their client's non-participation created a vacuum. He was physically present but legally absent, a ghost in his own trial. The jury, comprised of citizens who had paused their lives to perform a civic duty, stared at the defendant who could not be bothered to stay awake. His indifference was palpable, radiating from the defense table like a cold draft. Then came the shift. As the trial neared the conclusion of the state's case, the dynamic changed abruptly. The man who had spent days feigning unconsciousness suddenly became alert. Against the vehement advice of his legal counsel, Dotson demanded to take the stand. This is often the nightmare scenario for defense attorneys. A defendant opening themselves up to cross-examination can destroy months of preparation in minutes. Yet, the right to testify is absolute, belonging solely to the accused. No lawyer can silence a client who is determined to speak. The judge ensured Dotson understood the risks, conducting the standard colloquy to confirm the decision was voluntary. Dotson was resolute. He wanted the microphone. He wanted the attention. When he walked to the witness stand, the lethargy vanished. His posture straightened, and his eyes, previously hidden behind heavy lids, scanned the room with an unsettling intensity. The courtroom quieted, the anticipation thick. Everyone expected a denial. They expected him to claim an alibi, to blame a mysterious intruder, or to weave a complex narrative of innocence. That is the standard script for a murder defendant taking the stand. Joshua Dotson, however, had no interest in following the standard script. He had not come to plead for his freedom. He had come to claim his infamy. Under questioning, the facade of the sleepy, disinterested defendant crumbled, revealing a persona of chilling arrogance. He did not dance around the facts. He did not offer vague evasions. When asked about the death of Jamesha Covson, Dotson looked at the jury in the gallery and admitted to the crime, but he did not stop there. He treated the admission not as a confession of guilt, but as a statement of fact, devoid of remorse. He spoke of the killing with a clinical detachment that sent shivers through the courtroom. The legal strategy of his defense team evaporated in real time as their client dismantled his own presumption of innocence. The testimony quickly spiraled into something far darker than a simple admission. Dotson, seemingly energized by the shock on the faces around him, began to expand his narrative. He claimed responsibility for other unsolved murders, taunting the investigators and the court with the suggestion that his violence was far more prolific than they realized. He declared himself a serial killer, wearing the label like a badge of honor. The courtroom, usually a place of rigid order, felt like it was tilting on its axis. Dotson was no longer defending himself. He was bragging. The climax of this horrifying performance came when he sought to define his own nature. He looked out at the assembled court, the judge, the prosecutors, the weeping family, and invoked a figure of fictional, unstoppable evil. "I am Michael Myers," he stated. The reference to the antagonist of the Halloween film franchise was specific and calculated. Michael Myers is a character defined by his lack of humanity, a shape that exists only to kill, devoid of motive, reason, or mercy. By comparing himself to this character, Dotson was explicitly rejecting his own humanity. He was telling the court that he was not a man who had made a mistake, or even a criminal who had committed a crime of passion. He was asserting that he was a force of nature, an embodiment of pure evil that could not be understood or corrected, only feared. The prosecution, though likely stunned by the ease with which their case was being won for them, did not let up. They pressed him on the details, ensuring the record was clear. Dotson remained defiant, locked into his persona. He seemed to relish the comparison he had drawn, viewing the horror of the audience as validation. The Michael Myers comment was not a slip of the tongue, it was the thesis statement of his testimony. He wanted to be seen as a monster. He wanted the fear that comes with that designation. The sleeping defendant had woken up only to ensure that everyone knew exactly who he was. The jury's deliberation was a formality. After witnessing a defendant sleep through the evidence and then wake up to confess and compare himself to a horror movie slasher, there was no room for doubt. The verdict was guilty. But the legal process was not yet complete. The sentencing phase loomed, and the calendar conspired to add a final layer of macabre irony to the proceedings. Joshua Dotson was scheduled to be sentenced in late October 2024. The date that fell for his final judgment was October 31st, Halloween. The man who had proclaimed himself to be Michael Myers, the fictional killer inextricably linked to that specific holiday, would face his fate on the very day celebrated for its association with fear and the macabre. It was a coincidence that felt scripted, a narrative rhyme that underscored the surreal nature of the entire case. On that Thursday morning, Judge Lee Coffey presided over the final chapter of Dotson's legal journey. The courtroom was once again filled, the tension of the trial replaced by the solemnity of judgment. Dotson, back at the defense table, faced the consequences of his actions and his words. Judge Coffey, a seasoned jurist, known for his no-nonsense approach and deep respect for the sanctity of the court, was not amused by Dotson's theatrics or his claims of supernatural evil. He looked at the defendant, stripping away the myth Dotson had tried to build around himself. The judge addressed the Michael Myers comparison directly. He acknowledged the defendant's attempt to cast himself as a horror movie villain, noting the irony of the sentencing falling on Halloween. However, Judge Coffey made it clear that there was nothing entertaining or fictional about what Dotson had done. He dismantled the glamour of the serial killer persona Dotson had tried to adopt. In the eyes of the law, Dotson was not an unstoppable force of evil. He was a man who had committed a cowardly, brutal act against a pregnant woman who trusted him. The judge's words cut through the cinematic delusion, grounding the proceedings back in the harsh reality of loss and justice. Judge Coffey sentenced Joshua Dotson to a total of 102 years in prison. The sentence was a crushing blow, effectively a guarantee that Dotson would die behind bars. It was a rejection of any possibility of redemption. The breakdown of the sentence reflected the severity of the crimes. Intense consecutive terms for the murder of James Shakovson and the death of her unborn child. The judge emphasized that the community needed to be protected from a man who not only killed but reveled in the identity of a killer. The 102-year sentence served as a final, concrete answer to Dotson's testimony. Michael Myers, in the movies, always escapes or rises again to continue his spree. Joshua Dotson would not. The prison walls that would hold him were not part of a script. They were brick and mortar, unyielding and permanent. His attempt to elevate his crime into the realm of myth was met with the crushing weight of penal bureaucracy. He would not be haunting the streets of Memphis. He would be a number in the Tennessee Department of Correction, his life measured in headcounts and meal trays rather than sequels and scares. As he was led away, the Halloween connection lingered in the air, a strange footnote to a tragic case. The Michael Myers of Memphis had been unmasked, not as a supernatural entity, but as a narcissist whose desire for infamy had led him to destroy a family and his own future. The legal outcome was absolute. The sleeping defendant had woken up to talk himself into a century of incarceration. The courtroom emptied, leaving the Coveson family with the small solace that the man who took their daughter and grandchild would never walk free again. The theatrical nightmare Dotson tried to orchestrate ended not with a cliffhanger, but with the heavy, final thud of a gavel. The credits had rolled, and the screen had gone black. The calendar on the wall of the Shelby County courtroom displayed the date, the 31st of October 2024. For the general public, it was Halloween, a day dedicated to the celebration of the macabre, where children donned masks and horror movie marathons played on television screens across America. For Joshua Dotson, the coincidence of the calendar seemed to align perfectly with the delusion he had carefully cultivated throughout his trial. He had told the jury he was Michael Myers. He had claimed to be a walking horror film, a supernatural force of evil that could not be contained by societal norms. However, as Judge Lee Coffey took his seat at the bench to deliver the final judgment, the atmosphere in the courtroom was devoid of cinematic thrill. There was no suspenseful score, no shadowy lighting, and no scriptwriter to ensure the villain escaped to kill again. There was only the sterile, fluorescent reality of the Tennessee judicial system and the palpable grief of Jamasha Coveson's family. The sentencing hearing was the culmination of a spectacle that had baffled legal observers and horrified the community. Dotson's behavior, sleeping while his attorneys fought for his life, then waking to demand the spotlight and confess to heinous acts, had stripped away the usual ambiguity of criminal defense. He had not sought mercy. He had sought notoriety. Now, the state was prepared to answer his request for infamy with a crushing verdict of obscurity. Judge Coffey, known for his stern demeanor and intolerance for courtroom theatrics, looked down at the defendant. Dotson sat at the defense table, his earlier bravado muted by shackles and the presence of armed deputies. The judge prepared to dismantle the fantasy Dotson had built around himself, separating the man from the myth he so desperately wanted to embody. Judge Coffey began by addressing the specific counts for which the jury had returned guilty verdicts. The conviction for the second-degree murder of Jamasha Coveson carried the weight of a life cut short in a brutal, senseless act of domestic violence. The conviction for the attempted second-degree murder of her unborn child added a layer of tragedy that compounded the severity of the punishment. In the eyes of the law, Dotson had attacked 2 lives that day in 2020. The judge noted the defendant's extensive criminal history, a roadmap of escalating violence that had led inevitably to this moment. Dotson was not a first-time offender who had made a mistake. He was classified as a persistent offender, a status that allowed the court to impose sentences far exceeding the standard guidelines. The number finally pronounced by Judge Coffey echoed through the silent courtroom: 102 years. It was a sentence that defied the biological limits of the human lifespan. It was a mathematical guarantee that Joshua Dotson would die within the confines of a correctional facility. The 102 years were not merely a duration, they were a statement. By stacking the sentences consecutively rather than concurrently, the court ensured that there would be no parole hearing, no early release for good behavior, and no opportunity for Dotson to charm or frighten a parole board in the distant future. The sentence was an administrative burial, sealing the defendant away from the world he had sought to terrorize. After the technical pronouncement of the time to be served, Judge Coffey shifted his focus to the legacy Dotson had attempted to forge. During the trial, Dotson had explicitly compared himself to the fictional antagonist of the Halloween franchise, boasting of a serial killer persona. The judge addressed this directly, using the bench not just to punish, but to correct the record. He dismantled the glamour of the Michael Myers comparison with surgical precision. Michael Myers, the judge implied, was a fiction, a character who instills fear because he is unkillable and unknowable. Joshua Dotson, by contrast, was fully known. He was a man who had murdered a pregnant woman he claimed to love. There was nothing supernatural about domestic abuse. There was nothing mythic about shooting an unarmed woman. Judge Coffey characterized Dotson's actions not as the work of a master villain, but as the desperate, pathetic violence of a narcissist. He rebuked the defendant for his courtroom naps and his arrogant testimony, framing them as acts of cowardice rather than dominance. By sleeping during the trial, Dotson had shown a total disregard for the life he had taken, a final insult to Jamesha Covson and her family. The judge's words stripped away the costume Dotson had tried to wear. He told the court that while Dotson might view himself as a horror icon, the Department of Correction would view him simply as an inmate. The Michael Myers label was rejected by the court record. In the eyes of the law, he was merely inmate Dotson, a man who had forfeited his right to walk among free people. The irony of the Halloween sentencing was not lost on the court, but Judge Coffey used it to emphasize the finality of the judgment. While the world outside played at being scared for one night, the terror Dotson had inflicted on the Covson family was permanent and real. The judge expressed his sorrow for the victim's family, acknowledging that while the 102-year sentence provided justice, it could not provide restitution. It could not bring back the daughter, sister, and mother-to-be who had been stolen from them. The sentence was a mechanism of safety for the community, a way to ensure that the serial killer aspirations of the defendant would never be realized beyond the tragedy he had already caused. As the hearing concluded, the reaction in the gallery was one of somber relief. The family of Jamesha Covson, who had endured the defendant's taunts and indifference, finally saw the legal system work in their favor. There were tears, but they were tears of closure. The fear that Dotson might somehow manipulate the system or charm a jury into a lesser charge had evaporated. The sheer magnitude of the sentence over a century of incarceration meant they would never have to attend another parole hearing. They would never have to see his face on the news again, unless it was in an obituary decades from now. Dotson's reaction to his fate was scrutinized by every pair of eyes in the room. Throughout the trial, he had been the conductor of his own chaotic orchestra, interrupting lawyers and preening for the cameras. But as the reality of the 102-year sentence settled upon him, the performance ended. There were no more outbursts, no more claims of other bodies hidden in the dark, no more references to slasher films. The weight of the judge's rebuke seemed to press him into the chair. The realization that his audience was leaving and that the lights were being turned off permanently rendered him silent. He was shackled by bailiffs, the metallic click of the handcuffs, the only sound replacing his grandiose speeches. The transition from the courtroom to the transport van marked the final boundary between Joshua Dotson's delusions and his reality. He was led out of the building on the very day he had idolized, but there were no fans waiting, no sequel being filmed. The streets of Memphis continued their Halloween festivities, indifferent to the man who had tried to claim the holiday as his own. The 102-year sentence acted as a hermetic seal. It transformed him from a current threat to a past case. The files would be boxed up, the evidence stored, and the name Joshua Dotson would begin its slow fade from the public consciousness. In the end, the legacy of the Halloween sentencing was the triumph of reality over narcissism. Judge Coffey's judgment ensured that Dotson's story did not end with a cliffhanger. It ended with a period. The judicial rebuke served as a reminder that while criminals may seek to mythologize themselves, the justice system deals in facts, statutes, and years. Joshua Dotson had wanted to be remembered as a monster who transcended human limits. Instead, he was categorized as a violent offender with a release date that existed only in theory, far beyond the horizon of his natural life. The Michael Myers of Memphis was unmasked, processed, and removed, leaving behind only the silence of a prison cell and the enduring memory of the woman he killed.